I deeply believe that language models are an incredibly useful tool for all things knowledge work. I also believe, however, that the kind of LLM brain rot is very much real and that we might lose the ability to critically think if we rely on them too much. In this video, I don't really want to convince you of anything. I more want to kind of like treat this as a bit of a collective sense making, which is a bit funny because, you know, this is an inherently one directional channel. But I just read a lot of stuff around, you know, the effects of a language model or like your brain on ChatGPT and so on. And I wanted to kind of see whether I can reconcile some of the seemingly conflicting beliefs that I have developed. So how I want to kind of do this is to talk over the arguments kind of like against language models. I don't really like the phrasing of like, you know, like the papers or the articles are not like against language models, but more kind of like to have the full picture if you decide to use them. So that's going to be the first part where we talk over kind of like, you know, why you should maybe be concerned about using language models. And in the second part, I want to talk you through some of the use cases that I have found which are kind of like intellectually coherent with both sides of the coin, right? That like these are really useful tools and also with the kind of LLM brain rot idea. And I think that these two can coexist. We shall see. So this started off by me reading an article, which I will link in the description, which is titled Thoughts on Thinking. And then the author outlined here that they spent a lot of time using language models for learning. You know, it's like, hey, here is this topic and like I can learn so much about it and read up on any given topic so quickly. And then it was like amazing, you know, a bicycle for your mind. And after a while, the author felt that this kind of like subsided and then you kind of just like, it feels like mental scrolling, you know, it's like almost like sedation that you are learning because you are talking to a chatbot about a topic that you want to learn about, but it feels almost cheap because it's like these quickly, easily manufactured insights that you are getting. And then, you know, learning outcome is a thing for a reason in education, right? The point of a course is not for you to hand in the assignment, like the assignment doesn't really matter. What matters is that you go through the steps of making the assignment, which kind of will satisfy the learning goal. And this is what gets misaligned with language models very often, right? That people forget that, you know, the point of an essay is not to have the essay, but to have written the essay. I found this an incredibly convincing argument, and I experienced this a lot myself too. Anytime I have like a bigger problem around my thinking and I try to just like cram as much stuff into a strong model with a big context window and then get an insight, it might even be correct, but my development as a researcher is hindered by this, right? Because the exercise itself is for me to think through this and to be able to do it on my own. Because, you know, while for some issues it might actually be correct, but the whole idea of doing research, right, is that you're pushing the boundaries of what's out there and the language model will not help you out there. And I actually think that the scrolling or like sedation for your mind analogy of like language model learning is very apt, right? Because basically when you are like, you know, doom scrolling on your phone, what you are doing is roughly the same. That like it feels like you are consuming content, but it's not a meaningful consumption because the engagement is missing from behind it, right? Like if you go to a museum, that is a much more engaged form of consumption compared to, you know, if you scroll TikTok, which like breaks down any content or any idea or any, content, I guess is the best word. Like it breaks down to these like tiny atomic particles. And this is like the smallest denomination of content that we can create, right? Like it cannot get shortened. It's not like Vine is a 6-second, right? It's like atomized content bits that you consume. And that is just like a very, you know, it's processed content, right? Cal Newport talks about this all the time. And then there was the study done with MIT, I believe. I will link it in the description too. It's a publication, like it's a journal article published, which looked at kind of your brain, not your brain obviously, but like it looked at the human brain as you are using a language model for an essay writing task compared to a purely, analog person, a person with a search engine, and then a person with a language model, and kind of like how the brain activities differed, how the output quality differed, both judged by humans and an AI. And then basically what they found is that like your brain is just less engaged when you are using a language model, which is not particularly surprising, right? Because you can just outsource a lot of the menial work of forming the sentences. Even with a search engine, you can look up the facts, but then you have to make the sentence. I'm a big believer in like the learning by writing principle. I made a video about this a while back. The learning by writing, right? Like making the sentences is the difficult part. And then this is always very funny because if you ask a seasoned academic, it's like, oh yeah, you can write a paper in one day. The hard part is figuring out what to write. And I just really like that, right? Like there's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's excellent. I really resonate with that. Okay, so if you buy into this idea, then it might sound like that, LLMs are just bad and then they will rot your brain and you should just not touch them. And I don't believe that. And this is the second part, right? Where we will discuss kind of like what you still can or should do. I'm not gonna tell you what to do, right? Free country. I'm not the police, not your mom. You do whatever you want. What you can try with LLMs with the whole LLM brain rot in mind. I also want to kind of preface this by saying that I will not talk about coding. I think writing code is an activity with a language model which they are really well suited for. I think that the usefulness there is undeniable. It's just, of course, if you want to build like enterprise monolithic software, blah, 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 sure. But like I managed to write code in a language that I don't fluently program in, and you can outsource a bunch of small things. It allows you to focus on the bigger things. I will link a podcast about this. So if you're curious about like coding with language models, I'll link a podcast in the description. It's with Kent Beck, who is the creator of Extreme Programming and test-driven development, and then he was a big believer in paired programming. And I know that this is going on a bit of a tangent, so just bear with me. You can click the next timestamp if you don't care about this, but I think it's interesting. Pair programming the principle was that it's two people, one computer for programming. One of the people is doing the thinking, like the architecture and like the contour flow of the program. The second one is only doing the typing and like the syntax of the code. And then this way they were like magnitudes more efficient and quicker because you don't have to switch between the architecture thinking and the syntax thinking. And now you can just do pair programming by yourself because you can just focus on the big picture and then just like massage a language model as you go about it. It's amazing. I'll link the podcast if you care about like programming in a language model. Amazing read. Kent Beck is also just hilarious. So highly recommend. Okay, so now that the coding is out of the way. So the number one use case that I found that language models are very helpful for is to kind of get a layman's understanding of a topic lightning fast. So what I mean by a layman understanding, right? Because a lot of people treat these language models as search engines. Like, hey, what is the whatever? Not a really good use of this, right? Because you might just get factually incorrect information. However, if you just need a quick ballpark understanding of a topic, these models can give you that, right? Obviously, you should not take anything they say at face value. But if you are just curious, like, hey, how could these things relate to each other? Or like, what connections could there be? Or like, oh, what are the subfields of this? An example I experienced recently was I was at the conference and I had a random idea. It's like, we have a bunch of vectors and like we have these vectors and then, we only compute like the distances and like maybe we can do some more stuff with it. So I just went out in a coffee break, popped in some headphones, voice mode, absolute magic. I love it. Pop in some headphones and then in like a 5 to 10 minute walking around the parking lot and just like talking it over with the language model, I had like a vague understanding of the directions I could explore from here. It's like, here is the context, it's similar to this field, or, the people have done it in this way. And like, these are not facts, right? I'm not going to cite this in a research, but now I have a broad strokes map of what I can do. And it goes the same for, all kinds of like methodology-based modeling, or if you're just curious about a topic. Hey, if you would want to learn about this topic, where would you start? And then you can just like build out this broad strokes content map or concept map. And I think LLMs are very good for this. And then you should go to like actual verifiable source material to learn in details. But the big picture, I think they are very useful for. The second use case, which I think is a bit more unorthodox, is using these language models as a bit of an attention placeholder. This might sound strange, right? So let's just start from a step back. Your brain does a lot of the heavy lifting when you are not focused on something, right? A lot of great revelations happen in the shower or while doing dishes or while walking a dog, because your brain just like needs to defocus for a second and let it like simmer in the back of your head, right? I think that this experience is fairly universal. I found that it's very difficult to purposefully defocus when you are stuck on something. So if I am stuck on like a research problem, then what I will do is either just like try to like bash my head against it, which will block this, I won't allow it to move into the back of my mind to simmer, which obviously is not very productive, or I will shift my attention to something else similarly cognitively demanding, and then that will kind of just like break me out of that context, and then that also doesn't really allow it to simmer. And what I have found is that while language models are more like scrolling and sedation for your brain than actual analytical thinking, if you switch from bashing your head against the problem to chatting with a language model about this problem, this kind of scrolling like detached like vague connection to the material is enough to kind of take the problem, move it into the back of your mind, and then let it simmer while you are still in this context. And now I started abusing this. Like anytime I get stuck on something, I just pull up one of these like small little local models. I don't need it to be smart. I just need it to keep me engaged and vaguely on topic and start chatting with about it. And you can also go, the Socratic dialogue way of like, just like, like validate assumptions, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't really matter as long as you are like vaguely on track, but not actively thinking about solutions. To me, this was like a very strange experience, because I found that how I came to this, right, is that I use language models a lot to kind of think through problems. And then I almost always discarded everything they wrote as a reply to the problem, but I still left the conversation having solved the problem. And I was like, how is this possible? And I think this is the mechanism that is happening. At least that's my best guess. Yeah, so do try that. It's a very, very unique experience. This is very funny, right? There was that meme about like, oh yeah, like when ChatGPT first was really big, and then people started posting on LinkedIn like, oh, sometimes in the process of writing a really good prompt, like I discovered the solution. And then everyone was like, yeah, the AI goons have rediscovered thinking. And that was hilarious. I love it. But there is something in there, right? Especially if you kind of just like go a bit more methodical about this and then like deconstruct the problem, validate assumptions, all this stuff. I think that this is like a very helpful like sparring partner in this. You will still do the heavy lifting, but it's good to kind of talk it out, right? It's a way to externalize your thinking. You could also just like journal it out or, talk to a voice memo. But I think the chat interface makes it a bit more natural for a lot of people. So yeah, these are the 3 ways that I found that, while keeping in mind that, the whole brain rot of language models is very much a thing, I think that this kind of gives you the Pareto best benefits, and maybe even a bit of a net positive in using them. So let me know if you try any of these moves, because I found it very interesting to kind of observe myself as I'm working with these models, and it's a very fun experience. As closing, I do want to kind of highlight one thing that I could not make this video without pointing that out, right? That if you are using the language models as a way to kind of like outsource your thinking, or, like the cognitive part of your job, too, like, just like, okay, I want the language model to do my job, I would invite you to ask yourself the "and then what" question, which I made a video about. It's an amazing blog post by Austin Kleon. Just watch that video, think about it a bit. A bit of a rambly one. Thanks for sticking around. You have a great attention span. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.